Today we're going to answer a question that I admit, at first, seems pretty ridiculous. Is immersion brewing better than percolation brewing? Is something like a French press, therefore, better than something like a pour-over? The reason I want to do this is a few things have been bothering me at the back of my brain, and I've got an itch I need to scratch. I've been thinking about immersion brewing quite a lot, and in recent videos there have been times where immersion brews have been under-extracted but have still tasted pretty good. So here's the really simple experiment. I'm going to take a stock and quite common grinder, in this case I have an EK43, and I'm going to set it at 5 different grind settings, going from its coarsest setting all the way through to its very finest setting. We're then going to take those 5 grind settings and brew a cup of coffee with each of these 2 methods with them. And at the end of that, we'll do some extraction measurement. We'll see if one brew method performs better than another, but more importantly, at the end of all of that, when they've cooled down, I'll do a big taste test. I'll line them up and I'll do a head-to-head at each grind setting to see which one comes out on top. I will acknowledge now that that taste test will not be a blind test because I don't have anyone here to help me with that because of the way things are at the moment, but I still think it will be interesting for me to taste a comparison and go side by side. So let's begin. We're going to grind 20 grams of coffee for each brew. I don't think we need to brew much more than that, but brewing less than that I don't think necessarily would be fair or real world. To try and give you a little bit more insight, here are the 5 different grind settings showed next to the Kruve Brüler. So the way it's going to work is this. I'm going to brew a French press using my French press technique that I'm very fond of. You can check a video up here if you want to see how to do that. I'm going to let it steep for 4 minutes. I'm going to break the crust, scoop it off, and then I'm going to pour relatively quickly after that because I'm not worried about sediment. In this particular case, I'm worried about extraction. And later on, I'll obviously remove any sediment or suspended material from a sample that I'll do an extraction test with using a refractometer. As this steeps, I'm going to brew myself a nice little V60. All right, first round done, 4 more to go. Okay, 10 cups of coffee have been brewed. It took a reasonably long time, but we're done. We're through it. It was kind of interesting. Everything at the coarser end of things, which is here at the coarsest through to here at the finest, brewed very quickly, as you'd expect. In the middle, it kind of brewed quite normally at that sort of 8 setting, close to where I would be anyway. The moment we got to 4, things got muddy and soupy and weird, and by the time we were at 1, that pour over looked super odd. It looked like there was some sort of channel potentially there. I don't really understand what I was seeing in that bed at the end of that, but it didn't look good. Now, my original plan was to do the extraction measurements on these first, but I think I'm going to taste them. I think I'm going to taste them first to have as little bias as possible going in, because I am going to have a bias knowing which one is which in each case. Now for you, the ones at the front here are the immersion brews, and the ones at the back here are all of the percolation brews. Let's start at the coarsest end with these ones. I'll spare you the endless slurping noises. Having had a slurp, it's kind of interesting. So here at the very coarse end, they're both obviously quite empty, quite hollow, quite weak. There's a slight kind of tanginess, a slightly less pleasant acidity in the percolation and the pour-over brew than the immersion. Moving up just a little bit, there is definitely more texture to both of them. They do taste a bit stronger in both cases. The immersion brew does just taste a little bit sweeter. I don't know how else to describe it. Into the middle, which is actually kind of where I'd probably grind for both of them. So I would expect peak quality here. Yeah, both are very pleasant, both are very enjoyable here. They both have good qualities. The clarity that you get from paper filter is pleasant. That extra texture here and kind of richness is also very pleasant. Going finer again though, we see a big change. In both cases there's a slightly roastier characteristic to this coffee. This coffee is, I don't know very well, but it's sort of in the sort of medium range of things, I guess, for a filter coffee. So that roastiness is kind of there for both of them. The difference is that the percolation brew, the pour-over, has a pronounced kind of bitter attack to it that the immersion brew does not have. So there's a harshness and an astringency and a bitterness to this percolation brew that just tastes a lot less pleasant. It tastes ultimately like a much less even extraction at this point, and that's probably because we're starting to get some channels forming in that percolation brew. Things are starting to fall apart, and then you get to that very fine setting. The coffee's lost a lot of its fruit here as an immersion brew, but again, it's not overly bitter. It's not particularly harsh. It's quite muddy. It's difficult to discern flavour, but it's not unpleasant at all. It's really not that bad. The pour-over, though, Very harsh, very bitter, no sweetness, just really a lot less enjoyable. So here at the beginning, I'm going to call that one a draw. Neither is victorious particularly. Here, I don't really like to call it, but I'd probably say maybe the immersion, but it's pretty close. Here in the middle, like for like, I could not pick a winner. And then here, by this point, the immersion has pulled ahead. Right, the immersion brew is notably more delicious than the percolation brew. And at the end here, with that very fine grind, massive win to immersion brewing. The percolation is extremely unpleasant to drink. It is undrinkable, but I could drink. I wouldn't necessarily enjoy it, but I could drink that immersion brew. So we'll do some actual measurement in a moment. We'll measure those extractions and see how they chart out compared to what I tasted. And then we'll also talk about what the real world implications of that might be. How does this experiment matter to you in the real world? And then we'll talk about why it might be this way. Why would immersion have this advantage over percolation? Why might it, in these particular circumstances, be a better brewing method? I'm going to do that after a quick ad from this video's sponsor, which is Morning Brew. We all know a great cup of coffee is a fantastic way to start the day, but going down that social media rabbit hole or doom scrolling for an hour? Maybe not so much. That is why I would recommend checking out Morning Brew. It's a daily newspaper, Monday through Saturday. Turns up in the morning, it's a 5-minute read, but it is jam-packed full of everything you need to know for the day, business, finance, tech. I really enjoy it. It's well written, it's fun, it's easy to read, it's not dry and dull, and it leaves you in a better place. Whether it's getting up to speed on the newly formed workers' union within Google, or a bit of a UI, a deep dive for Spotify's new group sessions, there's always something super interesting in there that captures my attention. And the best thing about it is that it's free. It takes 15 seconds to sign up, and then that's it. It's going to turn up each morning and start your day off super well. Click the link down in the description below, and I say thank you to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video. So the measurement is done. All 10 samples have been measured. They were all stirred before a measurement was taken, and those that were from the French press were filtered again through paper to make sure that there was no suspended material to mess up our results. Now, what's important about refractometer numbers is not to take them as absolutes. There are a number of other factors here that I don't really want to get into. What we can look at, what is valuable, are trends. With the immersion brews, most of those numbers are in the kind of good extraction zone. Again, I don't want to get too much into that, but the way that they increase seems to make sense. The finer you grind, the more extraction you see with an immersion brew, and that's reasonably linear, not entirely, but reasonably, and it sort of starts to top out as we get towards the threshold of what is easily extracted from coffee. With the V60, something very interesting happens. We see that increase in extraction each time, and then suddenly it seems to plateau, and then it falls back, and at the finest grind setting, we saw the lowest extraction. What on earth is going on there? Surely that defies convention, but actually, this is a phenomenon you see all the time in espresso. When you go too fine, you get channeling. Generally speaking, if water can find a path of less resistance, a channel, then more of that water will flow through that part of the bed. The coffee around that channel will have a lot of extraction because most of the water has flowed through it, and the rest of the coffee won't see as much extraction, which is why on the whole, the bed is under-extracted even though the taste was extremely bitter and unpleasant. And so it would be a fair argument to say across grind sizes, immersion brewing does a better job, because it does. It does a better job because all of the coffee spends a good amount of time in contact with all of the brew water. With percolation, the brew time is quite variable and it's determined by the size of the grind for the most part. Now, when it comes to coffee theory and extraction theory, it's important to understand that very little water penetrates into the grinds of the coffee. Mostly it's washing away what is on the surface of those grounds. That means your limit for extraction is set by your surface area. Immersion has the advantage of having all the time that you give it to do that extraction to whatever surface area is available. With percolation, your contact time is determined by the grind size, by the resistance it gives to the water as it flows through, and so with a coarse grind, your water doesn't get much contact time. And that's why it produces such inferior results typically compared to immersion brewing. As you go finer, it does get better, and we see that in terms of taste, but then you hit a wall of fineness where you've gone too fine and the water is looking for channels, finding them, exploiting them, and your extraction goes down and your taste gets much, much, much worse. But what does this all mean for the real world? Well, one, it doesn't mean you should stop brewing with percolation brewers and only use immersion brewers. That's ridiculous. You can get incredible cups of coffee from percolation brewing. I love pour-overs. I think they are delicious. This is not what I'm saying. If you are stuck with a grind that is not suited for your pour-over method, though, brewing it with an immersion brew is likely to yield you better results. And this, I think, also explains the enduring popularity of something like the AeroPress. The AeroPress combines immersion brewing with percolation. You have this sort of steeping phase typically, followed by some percolation. And I think giving a decent amount of time, and I generally prefer longer steeps in an AeroPress, I think for this reason, means that you're likely to have a pretty good infusion, a pretty good immersion brew, before you then go through an additional percolation phase. But the AeroPress is something we'll talk about another time. But now I want to hear from you. I hope this is going to be a useful little tip, a little trick, a little hack to have in the tool bag should you end up with coffee ground in a way that you don't want it to be ground. What should I have tested? What didn't we test? What should we look at in the future in these kind of tests and experiments? I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.